Hello, I am Jennifer Yeates. I am the new leader of Girls Discovery Camp. Yes, the best of all the camps. I am also, I have been a teacher for 19 years, which makes me feel very old to say it out loud, and vice principal in Limavady Valley Grammar School. Every day I deal with young people and anxiety, and I work with lots of agencies in school and outside of school and groups that help students to cope with that every day. So those really are my credentials for speaking to you. Sarah is going to do the second half of our talk. She will introduce herself, and in a very short amount of time, Sarah got a bit carried away upstairs. And she'll give you some practical strategies. But in our various camps and in our different roles, we have such an amazing opportunity to walk alongside young people and to help them in all the things that are going on inside their heads. They're really at a really formative time in their life, all of them, right from the P6s that I have up to the 20-somethings that some of you'll have in senior camp. And I know that my time at camp had a hugely beneficial impact on my life, and for many of you the same. And that's our hope, that for all of the young people that are coming in front of us, they will leave knowing God, and they will leave having had a wonderful time and making really great friendships that are going to help them in their Christian journey. So obviously today we are addressing anxiety. It's one of the biggest issues that face children today, particularly in Northern Ireland. There's some statistics for you here. 1 in 4 young people in Northern Ireland experience anxiety between the ages of 11 and 19. That means a quarter of the people at your camp, minimum, are experiencing anxiety. That could include your leaders, it probably does. 2020 Northern Ireland Wellbeing Survey in Northern Ireland reported 12.6% of children met the criteria for a common mental health disorder. And University of Ulster research revealed that 45% of 16-year-olds felt anxious most or all of the time. Now, some of you know what that feels like. Some of you do not. A long time ago, I was a leader in Adventure Camp. And if you'd asked me at that point, I would have been one of the people that had never experienced anxiety, apart from maybe like the last 24 hours before my A-level exams. And beyond that, anxiety was not something I had ever come across. In general life, the things that make me feel anxious, I said upstairs, were an interview, very anxious, or running in a race, not just running normally, but running in a proper race, like with a medal at the end. I'll be so anxious, I'll be talking like this. It's not a good scenario. Even if it's just park run, it's not good, it doesn't help me. Well, that's in my normal life, well, what I would call normality for me. But at other times in life, I have had anxiety that's here, like to the point of, I would imagine, almost as bad as I could be. And that, for me, it was not a normal thing. And for some of you, you'll have points in your life where you feel like that. Some of you will never have experienced that, and some of you will actually experience that all the time. So that's just your normal. Your normal is to feel like that. And that's the same for the people that you're coming across in camp. Anxiety could be normal, could be something they've never experienced, or they might just be really anxious because they don't know anybody. Or they have to play a new sport or do paddleboarding, and they're afraid they're going to drown. So anxiety will come into your experience of camp in some way or another. It's not a thing that we don't hear about in the Bible. It's very much present there. In the Psalms, David cries out, "When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought me joy." Jesus, when he's speaking to the disciples, says, "Do not let your heart be troubled." So scripture acknowledges that worry and fear are real things for people. Paul, the great apostle, wrote honestly about feeling pressure and inward turmoil in Corinthians. And Elijah, one of the greatest prophets, after a victory in Mount Carmel, fled to the wilderness, overwhelmed and afraid, and said, I have had enough, Lord, take my life. So we come across anxiety in the Bible, and God didn't rebuke him. He met Elijah with rest, with nourishment, with a gentle whisper. The Bible doesn't dismiss anxiety, it meets it with compassion and wisdom and the presence of a God who draws near. And as leaders, we want to show each of our campers God's love. And as this is something that they may or may not be experiencing, we need to think about that and make sure that we're showing that to them. As we look at how to support teenagers in their anxiety, we need to be reminded of how God supports us in ours. So we can lead from a place of empathy, and Sarah will talk a wee bit more about that later on. So what does anxiety actually look like? Got a list of things here. Is there anything that pops out to you there that you would say yes? Anything that stands out? Last group were a little bit interactive, but they weren't in such a big room. Said Sarah's a little bit like assembly. The year 8s are super interactive, but when we get up to the older ones, they're not going to say anything.
Stomach aches.
Stomach aches, yeah. So that's an actual physical symptom of anxiety. Same with the headaches. So if it's bad for someone, it can actually lead to, you know that feeling of nervousness you get before something? Like for some people, that's every day, all the time. Or the stomach aches can come with that, the worse it gets. Any others? Yes. Yeah, that was one that we talked about upstairs too. So, some people more than others, well, all of us to an extent want to please people, but some people really, they want to get that right. If they feel like they have done something to upset someone, that's going to be really hard for them to process. And at camp, you think about, if you can remember back to you being at camp, maybe for the first time going into a room of people that maybe you don't know. And for a lot of them, they won't know anybody. And they're trying to make new friends. That's hard. If I put any of you into a room with nobody you knew and you had to make new friends, most of you wouldn't like it. So they're trying to make a good impression, they're trying to fit in, and they don't want to do anything to jeopardize that, so they're really going to be trying to please people. Any others?
High achievement.
Yes. Yeah, so some of the things maybe like when we look on a little bit more, okay, not loud enough. Some of the things that we would expect are maybe are people to be quieter or more nervous if they're anxious, but actually there's other things in there that maybe we don't think about as much that can also be symptoms of anxiety. So it's not always obvious. So sometimes if a child is really quiet, sometimes you might think, oh, they're just really lazy, or they're just really grumpy, they're defiant, they don't listen to anything that I say, they're so annoying. They don't want to take part in any activities. You come the whole way to camp and you don't even want to do this. You won't join in. Some might seem on edge. They might seem irritable. Someone annoys them. They're really quick to get grumpy. The physical symptoms we talked about. I want to tell you about 2 children that I've come across. One only a couple of weeks ago in my class. He came in to class. He is normally a rascal. He's 16. He really doesn't want to be in school very much. He likes to talk. He's perfectly nice. He's a lovely boy. But he came into class and he was talking to his friend. They're always talking. They're always supposed to sit here and here. They always start off here and here. And I say, okay, boys, that's all right if you don't talk. 30 seconds in, they're talking. Right, okay, move to the end of the row. I wasn't talking. Yeah, you are, move up. No, I wasn't. And then he got cross. I don't want to switch into the cross voice in case I scare you all. But he was very cross. He went from here to here instantly, and was shouting at me. No, I wasn't talking. I'm not going to move. Yeah, you are. He moved. Now, I didn't get cross. Maybe 19 years ago, I probably would have got cross. Didn't get cross. He did have to move. But his normal is not angry. It's not normal for any child to be shouting because you've said they're talking and they were talking. He obviously knew he was talking. He's not delusional. Something had happened to him. Maybe in the class before, another teacher had been shouting at him. Or maybe he got a bad test result. I don't know what it was, but something had happened to make him do that. Yes, he still had to move, but his reaction was a result of what was going on inside him. It was a result of his anxiety and whatever he was going through. So I'm telling you that story because the behaviour that a child in front of you exhibits, yes, it might be bad behaviour. He still shouldn't have been talking. He still, for my class to work, he has to not talk and listen. But he also, I have to recognise that there's things going on there. So it can result in bad behaviour. But also we mentioned perfectionism, people-pleasing, struggling to concentrate, feeling overwhelmed all the time, just thinking about who am I going to sit beside? Nobody's going to sit beside me when I go in for dinner. Panic. You maybe forget what that's like. But if you think back to you going into camp in the where you're going to sit, who am I going to sit beside? Is somebody going to be my friend? Is somebody not? Oh, we're going to play games now. I really can't play Unihawk. This is going to be awful. Everybody's going to laugh at me. All the time, thoughts. So I'm going to tell you about another student. I came across this student about 8 years ago. And this student was a perfect student. They were very well-mannered, very smiley, quiet, really just lovely. Maybe he didn't talk very much in class, wouldn't have volunteered answers, but if you asked him a question, he would have answered. And that was when I was introduced to my favourite of all the datas, which is called past data. Any teachers come across past data? No. It's the best of all the datas. So this data assesses children's attitude to themselves and to school. And it gives you markers. And one of the markers is self-regard. If a student's self-regard is low, that means it's not self-esteem, it's how they see themselves. So if that is low, everything else is going to go wrong. And when I looked at this child's data, theirs was the lowest it could possibly be. This was the perfect child sitting in front of me. And I started a little group, and we went through a course of just like fun activities. They started to open up and they started to talk to me. And by the end of this, I think it was an 8-week block, I had found out that this child every night went home. He couldn't sleep. He didn't sleep because he was thinking and playing over every conversation that he had had. He was thinking about every homework. He was worrying about if the homework wasn't done, or if it wasn't done right, or if he had handed in the homework on time, but what if he'd done this bit wrong, and what if this, what if this, what if this? This was going round in his head all the time. He was just a bag of worry, anxiety. He felt nervous and sick all the time. And that was his life. So I'm telling you that story because all of the people in front of you are probably going to be nervous and anxious to a point because they're at camp, which is new. Even the ones that have been there before are going to be feeling like that before they go back. Some of them to a greater extent than others. As leaders, we need to look past the surface and tune into what's going on behind the behaviour. So we're not... In school, I see a student growing up, so if their behaviour changes, that's a warning. But you only are there for a week, so you're not going to necessarily see big changes, but you are still looking at what's going on in front of you. So our role isn't to fix the anxiety or to diagnose anything or make any kind of medical diagnosis or judgments. There are some things not to do. Don't interrupt and offer quick fixes. We need to listen, to really listen. And Sarah will talk a little bit more about that. Not just try and fix them straight away. The Bible teaches us not to worry. But, and Sarah will probably say this again too, but if someone comes to you, if they have made the step of telling you how they're feeling and you say, oh, don't worry, the Bible says don't worry, you shouldn't be worrying, that's not probably going to be very helpful for them. It can be a little bit dismissive to say, oh, you need to just stop doing that. Christians, we don't worry, so don't worry. Just get on with it. It's not that easy. We also don't want to make a joke out of it. We don't want to mock them. Our expectations of what a camper should be like may not be how a child presents, depending on what you think a camper should be like. You maybe think they should be enthusiastic and wanting to join in and do everything. Some of them won't. And they're not being awkward. And they're not doing it or saying, oh, I don't want to play this, just for no reason. And you don't necessarily have to work out what the reason is, but to say to them, oh, just chill out, it'll be all right, join in, come on, everybody has... That won't necessarily work. So just think about the child in front of you. Don't minimize their feelings. And also don't put pressure on them to try and open up. They don't have to reveal their whole life history and everything that's gone on to lead to this point. So what to do? And Sarah's going to tell you a lot more about this, but just before she speaks to you, I want to leave you with this verse. We're to walk gently alongside them in grace and patience and reassurance. Ephesians 4 says, I therefore urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience and bearing with one another in love.
I made the joke upstairs too. I get really nervous about running as well, so I don't do it. And I told them that there's a verse in Proverbs, I think it's Proverbs 28 verse 1, only the wicked run when no one is chasing them. What does that say about Jennifer? Give me 2 seconds here. I'll just log into this. Okay, I'm not really going to show you many slides, so yeah. So, like Jennifer said, actually I don't know if she said it this time, I trained many years ago in counselling after my degree, and I worked as an adult counsellor, and whilst I was working with adults, I started to realise that adults were missing certain skills that I maybe had received in my family and my friendship groups, even through my church. And so what I did was I actually began a mentoring program in some schools in Limavady. I didn't counsel the children, I went in as a mentor. I no longer work as a counsellor any longer. I actually am doing something completely unrelated. I'm doing a PhD in 19th century Irish history. So you can all breathe a sigh of relief that I'm not giving you a talk on that. So my role here is to give you a wee bit of background information and then maybe give you some strategies that might help you in camp to help with children who may be suffering from anxiety. So initially when I went into schools, I did one-to-one work with children, and it quickly became clear that one-to-one wasn't going to work. I needed to work with these children in groups, and it stood out. And this is going to sound so simple and so basic, and I imagine that most of you will have had a similar experience to mine. What I found with some of the children I was working with was they didn't play games with their families. They didn't play board games with their siblings or their mum and dad. They didn't play outside with other children. They were very isolated and individuals. And they would maybe sit and eat their dinner, scrolling on a phone or an iPad, or watching TV. And a lot of them, understandably so, because their parents were busy, both mum and dad working, they were given iPads or TV programs to watch whilst their parents tried to manage the busyness of life. That sounds really very innocent, and probably most children love that. Yes, it's iPad time, but it really made them miss out on some very basic skills. And this is some of them. They didn't know how to be a good loser or a good winner. They didn't know how to take turns. They didn't know how to engage with other people. They didn't know how to read other people's expressions. They didn't know how to read how their behaviour would affect someone else. And they viewed themselves as an individual, not as part of a group. So when they looked at themselves in class, their class was essentially made up of maybe 30 individuals rather than this is my class. And this lack of skills, basic social skills, actually can contribute to a child's anxiety. It's like a vicious cycle. So if you don't know how to interact with other children, then you start to become anxious because you're not interacting well. Now your anxiety makes it more difficult for you to interact, and so you get stuck in this cycle of not being able to interact with other people and other children your age. It also impacts children who have never experienced anxiety. So if you don't know how to read other people's behaviour or to show compassion and empathy because you're an individual and you do everything on your own, then when you get children into camp who have no anxiety and they meet children who have anxiety, this is going to be a really bad combo, because to those children this seems ridiculous. Why would you get anxious about that? That's a load of nonsense. So those skills that children are lacking affect both the anxious and the non-anxious child in different ways. There are other things that impact children and how they deal with anxiety. And I mentioned upstairs, there's one sentence I'm sure most of you have heard an adult say to a child: we're all winners. And that seems to be a theme in society, that you don't want to disappoint a child by saying we're not all winners. So every child must feel like they're a winner. Well, that's not true. We're not all winners. We're just not. We might do well in one area but fail in another. That's the beauty of life. So when a child is told that they're all winners, if they get to camp and they lose, their reaction is not going to be great because they haven't won and they were told by an adult that they were a winner. And this can then contribute to their anxiety at camp, because I haven't done as well at camp as I thought I would, because in school or at home I'm given everything I want when I want it, and it leads to a lack of resilience. So what you might find is children who lack resilience seem to overreact to the smallest of things. They seem dramatic. And it's because they're not used to it. They don't have that skill. They're very sensitive to what they perceive as criticism. It might not be criticism. You might not have intended it as criticism, but they perceive it as criticism, and their anxiety levels escalate. I told the story up here, but now it's a bit more scary to tell down here because Marcus is sitting right there. But he told me a story from him at boys camp, and I thought to myself, I wonder, are there any boys that were in his group? Marcus was leading a group, and I don't know who the other officer was. Was it Joel McCavery? I want to guess was your other officer. So he was sharing the group. This is how the information got back to his team. And all the boys were sitting, chit-chatting about their lives, and Marcus very helpfully said, boys, you have got to realise that most of your dreams won't come true. So this got back to the boys camp team at officer devotions, and they all thought this was hilarious. But the reality was that there was an element of truth in what Marcus said. It may not have been presented in the nicest of manner or at the right moment, but there was a reality of truth in it. And oftentimes I found in schools that there were children who were set up by well-intentioned adults for a fall. And that meant that their reactions were really extreme, and that was the reactions that teachers were having to deal with. Thankfully, my mother never told me that I could be whatever I wanted to be, because ask Marcus, if I had wanted to be a mathematician, we would have been snookered if you were dependent on my mathematical skill. Ask me a simple maths question and you will find out pretty quickly. But I think what we need to remember is this is not the children's fault that they lack these skills. I find that children were lacking these skills because of changes in approach into parenting, the difficulties in our modern life, and unfortunately, in more cases than I'd like to see, it was neglect. And you can think neglectful parents look a certain way, but neglect can be very unintentional. So you can't just assume, oh, by the look of that child, they might have been neglected. Also, technology. We hear a lot about technology and the impact it has on children's developments, and I would imagine that we don't know the full impact yet of technology. There's so many benefits to technology, I couldn't survive without it, but that's only if it's used correctly, because if used incorrectly, there are so many negatives. And some of the most obvious ways is for all of us, not just the children that are coming to camp, it's going to be attention span. So if you think even the difference from whenever I was a child, children are watching shorts on YouTube and TikTok. Everything's very minute by minute, even second by second. Your attention is changing every couple of seconds. Even TV programs, the scene is constantly changing. So you're going to find that children, when they're asked to sit and concentrate on a talk, the scene is not going to change. So they're going to get maybe more agitated and more anxious because they're not used to just sitting and concentrating for a long period of time. Also, social media, it's hard for us as adults to understand that we are getting a little snapshot into someone's life. So when they look at it, they think, wow, that person's life is perfect, but they don't see the mess behind the camera. And that pressure can make children very, very anxious. Even in camp, children can present themselves as having it all together, and another child might look on and think, I don't do my quiet time as often as that girl. I'm not as good at football as that boy. And there's all of these expectations that children are trying to live up to. On a really practical level, I gave them the tips upstairs for what we can do as camp leaders. And one of them, I wouldn't be so keen on this one, but it is true. Exercise. Encourage all of the campers to engage as much as you can to engage with those activities that are exercise, because this releases hormones in our brains that helps us to feel happier. It's just a fact. It's not a notion that someone came up with. It's a fact. Marcus is smiling because I don't do it. Also, I would advise you to try at all meal times to keep jugs of water on the table and encourage them to drink water. Sounds so silly, but it's so important. Your cortisol levels rise significantly when you're dehydrated. So try and encourage all your campers to be drinking. Don't be like, oh, decrease your cortisol levels, drink this water. Just gently encourage. It makes a really big difference. And I was saying to them upstairs, I think of it like diluting juice. So if you drink diluting juice straight, it's really hard to stomach. And that's what your cortisol levels are like when you're dehydrated. So if you pour in the water, now you can stomach it, now you can handle it. This next one, I think, is one of the most important ones, and it is tiredness. And the need to sleep can't be overemphasized. And it impacts us physically and mentally. And I really want to stress that, because even things like if children have their phone before bed, that blue light on your phone, the science of it is to do with your circadian rhythm. How boring. But you might get to sleep. I can sleep very easily after looking at my phone, but the depth of my sleep will be the problem. I won't get into the deep sleep and get into the proper rhythm. And you might feel like you're ruining the campers' fun, but you're actually not. You're helping them. And I said upstairs too, sleep deprivation isn't a torture tactic for no reason. It is so debilitating when you haven't got sleep. And for anxiety, those campers who have anxiety, their anxiety levels will escalate dramatically if they haven't got enough sleep. So yeah, I really encourage you to do that. And I said upstairs as well that if you have 39 campers that aren't anxious and 10 who are, it's important enough that you get all of those campers to bed so that you help those 10. We want to try and make camp accessible for everybody, and you don't want them in their room and in their own mind in a chaos and not being able to process their anxiety on their own and not having their usual people there to help them, like their mum and dad. The next point you are going to think obvious, but we need to remember as camp leaders that we're dealing with children and young people. And I've heard so many times in schools and witnessed adults treating children like they're not equals when they're talking about intellectual stuff, but when it comes to behaviour, we treat them as equals. They're not equal. they're not fully developed. And I apologise to the boys, I'll apologise to you here too. Girls, cognitive development is completed by the age of 25. Yes. Boys, 30. Sorry. It's a part of your brain, it's the prefrontal cortex, and it just doesn't develop until you're 30. I can't help it, it wasn't me. Who did it? And that part of the brain regulates our anxiety levels. It helps us to concentrate, and it helps us with our impulse control as well. So you're expecting children to think like we do. So I tell Marcus all the time when he's dealing with our nieces and nephews, don't expect this 4-year-old to have 40 years of experience, because they don't. They have 4 years. Help them to understand. And there's going to be, as I said at the start, there's going to be children who never experience anxiety and don't understand it. Like Jennifer was saying, she never really experienced it as a child. Don't get frustrated with those children either. They don't have the knowledge. You need to take the time to explain to them what's going on, maybe for another child, and help them to understand it. Get to know all of the children at camp, understand what's a normal reaction, what's not. If they're easily angered and frustrated, figure out what's making them angry and frustrated, and if at all possible, try and avoid anything that's going to exacerbate that. Speak to them with respect. Just because they're children doesn't mean you have the right to speak down to them. And that's why I told you at the start what I'm now doing. That I wouldn't shout at you or get angry at you that you don't know anything about 19th century Irish history. I just would be like, you don't know it, fair enough. So I'm not going to treat you differently because you don't know anything about it. Okay. Jennifer's getting cross that it's taken too long upstairs, and she still probably is a little. These are some practical things that you can do. So the first one is to give them a role, give them a job. So if a child's feeling left out or homesick, one of the best things you can do is to give them a task to kind of distract them. But I would suggest don't just isolate one child. You need to get a little group together and give the little group the job, because if you just give this one child a job, they're going to stand out, they're going to seem different, and they might feel a wee bit like the teacher's pet, and other children might view them as the teacher's pet. And whenever I was in schools, I moved to working with groups rather than individuals, because I could see that they could learn from other children. So pick your groups really wisely. Don't gather together all of your anxious children and say, here's your job, off you go. Because guess what? The job's probably not going to get done because they're all going to be anxious about how to do it and what way's best and am I going to disappoint someone. You need to pick children who are compassionate, empathetic, maybe those who are just neither here nor there, a wee bit of Marcus, a wee bit of Jennifer in there who don't feel anxious. Mix the group up and pick them very, very wisely and carefully. Pick those who have empathy, and remember that empathy is not the same as sympathy. The next one I have up there is Psalm 46 verse 10. I love this. So I use it, it's brilliant, and teach it to children, use it yourself if you ever feel anxious. But what I ask you to do is repeat the verse like this. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Do it like that over and over again when you are going through anxiety, or when a child is going through anxiety. Repeat it with them. Get them to repeat it back to you. There's lots of strategies that the world and psychology have come up with to try and refocus our thoughts. And they're useful, but I think that as Christians we need to have God at the centre of our thinking. So to have a scripture verse that is repeated over and over and over again to children and to ourselves, that just naturally comes to mind when we next find ourselves in an anxious situation, is so incredibly useful. This is one of my favourite verses. Marcus calls it my verse. And I just think to try and encourage those children at camp to say that verse over and over again. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a worldly psychology tool. It's useful mostly if a child is having a panic attack. So it's 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And it moves down to those because I can see people going, huh, taste? But if I ask you sitting there right now, you'll taste something. And you now have to focus on, what is it? She says I should be able to taste something, what is it? And that focusing on, well, what on earth is that I taste now? The person's not anxious in the same way. They're not having the panic attack in the same way. Jennifer's already said to validate it. Don't dismiss them. Don't say, oh, that's a nonsense. Give them the time, and don't expect them to have your years of experience. Don't fob them off. Don't make them feel silly or stupid. And there's a concept in counselling called congruence, and it means agreement or harmony in everyday life, that word congruence. But in counselling terms, that basically means what you're thinking and feeling inside will be communicated by your body language on the outside. So if you're thinking, this child is really annoying, she's whinging at me again, I cannot be bothered. Even if you're like, of course dear, no bother, they will pick up, I'm annoying them, there's something funny here. What's going on inside is always communicated on the outside, and children can pick up on it. Essentially, remember, you have different parents, you have different teachers, different personalities, different siblings. So every single thing about you is completely different to every single person and every single child you're going to meet at camp. And I put this little bit in at the end. I don't know if people will have noticed behind me that I whipped out my laptop while Nick was speaking. I wasn't going to include this, so this is a wee added bonus. And I was thinking about what he was talking about, and what struck me was that he said, we are all broken. So everyone sitting here is broken, and I'm broken. And to be honest, that statement that Nick said this morning probably gave me the confidence to add in this little section. So if you don't trust me on these skills and tactics and strategies for dealing with anxiety because of my experience in school, I hope that you'll trust me based on the fact that I too suffer from anxiety and have done since I was a very small child. And I think it's so important to remember that the person with anxiety will not be wearing a sign saying, I have anxiety. I didn't feel any nerves or anxiety about giving this talk, not even one. Strangely, I never do. But if you gave me something ridiculous to be anxious about, I could be anxious about it. And children with anxiety don't always present in the way that you expect. And I can tell you that saying things like, you're a Christian, don't worry, guess what that makes you do? Now I'm anxious because I'm not a very good Christian. Saying, don't be anxious, I have had that said to me. Don't be anxious, and I say, oh, thanks so much for that. I hadn't tried that. I'll do that now. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's not logical. You cannot explain away anxiety with logic and reason. I could say to Marcus, I'm just about to tell you something I'm anxious about. It's really illogical. I know it's irrational, but just let me say it. And once I've said it, I feel better. But if he started to tell me, oh, that's a nonsense, I would now feel worse. So I thought about why I didn't have that in the talk in the first place. And it's because I was fearful of people's judgments. And we all form opinions before we know all of the facts. Every single one of us does. I was fearful of what you all would think of me. But the reality is what Nick said, we're all broken. So I may be broken in that way. Yous are all broken in different ways, or maybe in the exact same way as me. And if that's how I felt as a grown adult, talking to other grown adults, how's a child going to feel? They may not come to you and say, this is anxiety I'm suffering from. They might not even be able to label it. So I want to give you 3 things to end on. If you do these 3 things, I think you'll be able to support most children in most situations. Don't panic, ask questions, and listen. And if you do that, I don't think you'll go far wrong.